They say the mind bends and twists in order to deal with the horrors of life. I think my mind bent so much it snapped in two.
Previously in the Twisted Metal Retrospective, we discussed the birth of this game series and its early success leading to almost immediate misdirection, with developers less familiar with the original games doing their best with what resources they had, but ultimately delivering considerably poor entries. If you haven't watched part 1 of this retrospective, I suggest you do so beforehand as we continue to go down this twisted timeline with the co-creator David Jaffe chiming in and telling his own side of what it was like producing these games.
Make it stop! Make it stop! Make it stop!
Rated M for mature. Twisted Metal. Black.
Despite Twisted Metal 3 and 4 being considerably successful from a commercial standpoint, the development company behind those games, 989 Studios, was absorbed into Sony Computer Entertainment. This happened shortly after the launch of Twisted Metal 4, so those developers would no longer be involved in the franchise. David was actually part of 989 Studios, but in a completely separate team, creating the to-be-cancelled Dark Guns game we had discussed in the previous video.
I had gone off to make my own game called Dark Guns, and it did not go well. It was ultimately canceled, and I knew it was kind of moving in for a crash landing. At that time, we were up in Foster City, and we had the opportunity to open Santa Monica Studios, and it honestly was a really good kind of parachute out of the production disaster that was Dark Guns.
To tear down is to later rebuild. As Jaffe was coming out of the rubble of this scrapped game, he would become one of the core members to form a new Sony division known as Santa Monica Studio, in order to develop games for the upcoming PlayStation 2 console.
Scott Campbell wanted to leave GT Interactive and start his own thing. And so he reached out to Alan Becker at Sony and said, hey, would you guys be interested in working with us? And Alan was like, of course, we're starting this new studio in Santa Monica. I don't remember if it was Scott or us that proposed a new Twisted Metal, but we knew there was new hardware, and the fact that we would be working together again, it was kind of a no-brainer. Let's try to bring Twisted Metal back to its glory days, because we knew that Twisted Metal 3 and 4 had left a really kind of sour taste in a number of gamers' mouths who really liked the series previously.
After Twisted Metal 2, another entirely different group began working on Twisted 3 and Twisted 4, and their take on the game was different than ours.
Most people felt that the third and fourth installments of Twisted Metal did not live up to its predecessors.
Scott Campbell was one of the original developers behind Twisted Metal 1 and 2 when they were part of the team known as Single Track. David chose to leave Single Track after Twisted Metal 2 in order to attempt making Dark Guns back in 1996, while the people residing in that team were assigned to create other original games for GT Interactive. With this company also dissolving in the year 2000, many of those original developers were free to follow Scott in pursuit to get that original band back together. There was no better time for the original developers, through the power of Sony, to introduce car combat to a new generation of gaming on the PlayStation 2.
In terms of who actually proposed it to who, I don't remember. What I do remember about it was it seemed like a perfect stars alignment moment where they wanted to start a company. We were starting a new studio. I was coming off a really big flop that never really was able to get off the ground. So I needed to kind of, get back into sort of the sense of making something good that people liked. And so it all just kind of worked out and lined up, and we were kind of off to the races almost immediately.
A new Twisted Metal project was beginning to form. With the support of this first-party Santa Monica studio, David Jaffe and Scott Campbell formed a new team within it known as Incog Ink, or Incognito. This team was comprised of many seasoned single-track devs from ye old Twisted Metal 1 and 2 days, with Jaffe leading the helm. However, they were still mulling over how to reintroduce the true car combat experience for old fans and a new audience. One concept they were considering was dubbed Twisted Metal Road Trip USA.
Twisted Metal 3 and 4 had kind of deflated people's interest in the genre and in that specific property. And there was a sense of, okay, how are we going to bring this back to sort of the masses? How are we going to bring this back to people who are really excited about it? There were two ideas. One idea was what became Twisted Metal Black. And another one I was working on was basically more of like a throwback to Twisted Metal 2, but on PS2 technology, which was going to be Sweet Tooth kind of wearing an Uncle Sam hat. And it was going to sort of be more of a cartoony Twisted Metal 2 Road Trip USA. So it was going to be like fighting on Mount Rushmore, fighting on the Statue of Liberty, fighting on the Golden Gate Bridge, you know, sort of doing the world tour that we did in Twisted Metal 2, but kind of making it more American based, especially since we knew most of our audience were Americans anyway.
It sounds like a real follow-up to Twisted Metal 2 and how it was presented. That was the best-selling game in the series thus far, so why not a true successor in its style? The math couldn't be simpler. However, around this time, David was becoming enthralled in the darker side of entertainment. And I ain't talking about the scandals.
I was going back and forth between this kind of dark, violent, depressing world, which was inspired by things like Jacob's Ladder and Seven, and the art or the photography of a guy named Joel Peter Witkin, who actually would go to Mexico and purchase corpses from the morgue, and he would pose those in really weird fucking poses and really just disturbing, sometimes sexual imagery and stuff. And I was really vibing with that whole flavor.
It sounds deliciously creepy for sure, but wait, is he making a new Twisted Metal or a damn horror game? The correlations between this and the inspirations to something like Silent Hill are unmissable. Jaffe even started doubting the concept's potential, thinking it couldn't work for something like Twisted Metal, and I would have agreed.
But it seemed so out of the ordinary for what Twisted Metal was that there were moments where I thought, you know, this is going to be great because no one's going to be expecting this, and in that we can really surprise people. And then there were days where I'd come in and say, no, we need to do Twisted Metal Road Trip because that's totally what people expect, and let's give them what they expect, but let's just execute it really well because it's been a while since people have had a really well executed Twisted Metal.
Still, it took a strong will in his mind to just dive deep. Forget potential sales figures. Sometimes you just gotta listen to your gut, and his gut was screaming for a dreary, demented, and oppressively dismal Twisted Metal game. Perhaps part of him just refused to play it safe when it came to the series.
The truth of the matter is, if we would have gone with Twisted Metal Road Trip, it probably would have sold better than Twisted Metal Black because it probably would have maintained the T rating that the series up until that point had, which made it a lot more accessible to young kids that probably were vibing with the game as much as hardcore gamers. But I was at a place in my career where I was just like, I'm going to go for it. I have this vision. I want to work with the team to develop this vision. And there's something really cool and fun about playing in this really dark playground. And so we just said, fuck it, let's go with it. And I pitched it to marketing. Marketing was down with it. And so after that, we never looked back. We just said, fuck it, let's go dark and let's make this thing like brutal and scary and sinister and really make the world and specifically Sweet Tooth sort of into our own version of Michael Myers and Jason Voorhees.
With David being inspired by these haunting works, he would create a core-shaking piece that gaming communities and Twisted Metal fans alike could have never prepared for. This was quite an experience. Imagine me just running into a single magazine ad about a new Twisted Metal game at the ripe age of 11. A new Twisted Metal? Mom, I need it! I was so excited to see a new installment to my favorite wacky car combat series, complete with silly stories about eating souls and shit and cartoony cutscene endings. Oh geez, what is this? Why is it so scary? Everything's so dark, and these characters look terrifying. Oh my god, when you defeat an opponent, they run out of the explosion screaming while engulfed in flames. This unwelcoming world made me want to crawl into a corner and weep. It's amazing. You would think with this gallery of ghastly rogues and terrifying venues, Jaffe must have been dealing with some real internal suffering, horrible events taking place in his life reflecting onto his work.
Well, I mean, it wasn't my mindset. Like, I wasn't going through some kind of massive depression in my life, but I think it was just more recognizing that kind of underbelly of humanity, slasher movies, horror movies, psychological thrillers. You know, I was like 30 at the time, maybe. So, I mean, I was kind of leveling out with the stuff that I vibed with. And I was just like, you know what, I really liked that space. And so it wasn't so much that I was having a rough time in life, but I was comfortable acknowledging and embracing the fact that, hey, you know what, Jaffe, you have a dark side, and it's not just a dark side, it's a dark side that you really like to play with and connect with, and let's just fucking go for it.
Think again, jerk. You don't need to be a Debbie Downer in order to have a good grip of this kind of atmosphere. With David's desire to make this title a unique experience from the previous games, they would take an extremely dark and twisted approach, the likes that Twisted Metal 1 and 2 have never seen. The environment ranged between dead of night to the sun getting drowned out by a gloomy overcast. Just about all the color tones look like they came from an abandoned slaughterhouse. Everything looks so dystopian and run down. It's just miserable. In a good way. All the stages from the original Twisted Metal are represented in this game, taking us back to that suburbia setting, as well as adding some industrial areas and a gigantic prison boat venue, complete with random people running for their lives. It's less cartoonish than the games before this, so I'd imagine players might find it to be more frightening than humorous. I swear you can hear kids in those screams. Unlike Twisted Metal previous, the music didn't go for a cheesy rock and roll or hair metal vibe. Instead, it would have what sounds like this incredible symphony. Among this orchestra included composers famous for creating scores of acclaimed films. These exigent, borderline rapturous tracks fit the game and its environment perfectly, really immersing the player and hammering down the idea that this world is horrifying. The core mechanics remain unchanged from Twisted Metal 2, although, thanks to this title being designed under brand new hardware that was the PlayStation 2, as well as being able to utilize the DualShock controller's analog sticks, the game is a huge step up from the previous titles regarding gameplay and controls. Everything was refined so well and felt significantly smoother than its PlayStation 1 counterparts. This was also the first game in the series to be set at 60 frames per second, which also helped crank the pace of the chaotic gameplay tremendously. This all brought a level of strategy and high-level play that the designers themselves didn't even intend.
There's a Twisted Metal fan website out there. They really came of age and fell in love with a lot of Twisted Metal because of Black. And they would send me videos of this really amazing gameplay where they were able to dodge certain missiles and dodge bullets and drive backwards to create dodging to homing weapons that we never thought were dodgeable. None of that was intentional. None of that was like we consciously sat there and designed that. It was just all the pieces worked together and they figured out how to play that instrument that we happened to build.
Nothing more than a happy accident. Hey, that's how combos became the norm for fighting games. The rapid pace of the gameplay melded onto the enemy AI. While it appears they aren't too responsive from afar, it's when you get close that they become considerably spastic. These bots put what they can into taking you down pretty often. As far as I can tell, they don't blatantly cheat like they did in the previous titles. Twisted Metal Black, simply put, felt phenomenal. No matter what way you look at this game, you can see they gave so much attention to detail regarding just about everything. Stage secrets and Easter eggs make a return, but are more intricate than ever before. Even the menus are awesome. Character selection is very dynamic, and they also provide profiles in the style of mental ward entries. For every single vehicle, there are different compartments for each weapon, indicating where exactly that weapon will launch. They don't just fire from your grill anymore. The design for the two boss fights in this campaign were given more attention than before. You couldn't just shoot it until it dies all willy-nilly. Now you have to strategize and control your character as well as you can in order to figure out how to reveal their weakness, and then shoot that until it dies. Rightfully so, Minion serves as a midway boss like in Twisted Metal 2, and Warhawk, a throwback to the original single-track game developed alongside Twisted Metal 1 back in 1995, serves as the final boss. a gigantic attack helicopter. This beast was almost a playable character, but ultimately got the cut, a mystery eluding Twisted Metal fans for years. The idea of it is definitely too ambitious considering what the core gameplay focused on.
When people talk to me about Warhawk being playable in Twisted Metal Black, it's something I take on faith because I don't remember that. It doesn't surprise me that that was planned. I almost kind of maybe remember writing some dialogue for the character's loading screen even, but it definitely was lack of time. Anything that got cut was lack of time and or the fact that when you're dealing with flight, you know, it's a new dimension you're introducing to a game that historically has been grounded. And it probably was one of those things that were like, yeah, let's put a fucking helicopter in as one of the secret characters. We already have the model. We have the effects. This will be great. And then we were running out of time probably. And the coders looked at it and said, you're going to have a shit ton of problems with this because we haven't built these levels to keep helicopters from going out of the levels. And we're going to have to probably spend an extra 3 months just to figure out how to solve this. Are you sure you want to do it? And it was like, so that's probably why we didn't include it. It wasn't something that we had Warhawk flying around and playable. And at the last minute we cut it because, you know, there was some awful helicopter crash in the news. And it was nothing dramatic like that. It was just a big idea, like a lot of big ideas in games that you kind of take baby steps and then you realize you're out of time and something's got to go. And that was probably one of the things that went.
Let's talk about the story now. Its presentation received a massive overhaul as well. While the cutscenes return with a style similar to Twisted Metal 2, the artistry behind its animation was very different. No longer would they look like papercraft figures conveying the idea of moving, they would have dynamic still images with few effects, or just use traditional animation when necessary. It's all still pleasing to the eye and melds with the atmosphere excellently. The writing team of the game even included Paul Jenkins, who wrote The Darkness 1 and 2, a game duology I plan to discuss soon.
I knew him from writing Spider-Man. He wrote Wolverine Origins. He's a pretty big, well-known comic book writer, specifically with Marvel. Now he's doing a lot of indie stuff. I'm trying to think why I reached out to him specifically, what he was writing at the time. He may have written some issues of Spawn. I don't remember how we touched base, but he's been a friend ever since. And yeah, I mean, he's a super amazing writer.
Something that really stuck with people was how these cutscenes were presented. To my surprise, this style was not what they initially planned.
So basically the stories on Black were originally going to be fully animated. And I worked with a guy named Jeff Goldsmith to write the basic stories as scripts. And so it was me, Jeff Goldsmith, Martin Mercer up in the Sony conference room, sometimes pulling all-nighters. I remember Martin sleeping under the table and everything. I mean, it was brutal to get these storyboarded and written, and we were storyboarding them while we were writing them. And it turned out towards the end, we just didn't have the time or money to fully animate everything. And so when they had to get cut down into more of the kind of semi-moving slideshow that they are now, I reached out to Paul because, you know, he was good with sort of internal monologue because of the comics. There are still some shots in it where it's fully animated, and we tried to keep as much as that as we could, but end of the day, it was taking way too long. We just couldn't get it done in time.
I think this is a testament to what kind of greatness can come out of a project through limitation, even regarding time or budget. If you ask me, the limited animation with these stylish angles and transitions made these cutscenes age like fine wine. As for the story itself, the theme remains consistent. Calypso pits all these unique psychopaths in one tournament across dismal cities, although it wasn't structured exactly the same way. Instead of promising a single wish of their desire, which you'd witness your character redeem at the end of the contest as Calypso fabricates their desire through his magical abilities, before even meeting each character for the first time, Calypso knows what they desire, and he's ready to provide as soon as they prove themselves in the contest. And most of the time, their wishes weren't even that materialistic or vain, especially compared to most of the stories in Twisted Metal 2.
He said he ran a contest. Winner take all. In my case, first prize meant getting even with the man who stole my sanity.
They're a lot more personal, focusing on events or tragedies that dwell on these demented folks.
If I won his contest, he would reveal the truth. It had been 2 years since the beast had entered my mind, controlling my actions, making others believe I was responsible for those killings.
Whether it be the chance for them to simply get their old life back, pure revenge on the people that took away the ones they loved, or to simply know the truth that's been escaping them all this time. Seeing as how nearly every single contestant is locked up in this asylum, Calypso not only grants them parole, somehow, but also supposedly a shot at a better life. What was interesting to me is, dissimilar to the previous games, the gift Calypso grants the character in each ending is under his own terms and isn't just something the character springs on him at the ending.
It was time for him to prove my innocence and clear my name. And yet, he seemed hesitant. I made no promise to clear your name, he said. I only promised to show you the truth.
We also have a few rogues that bust their way into this contest without Calypso's consent. With this expansion in the story's presentation came a big change. For the main cast, it was no longer just one cutscene as their ending. This time they would each receive 3 separate cutscenes to represent their endurance, their past, and conclusion. Layered between these acts, you're treated to inner monologue of the character during loading screens. But of course, if you're expecting them to be as goofy and cartoonish as the character endings from the original Twisted Metal games, you've got another thing coming.
The genre had switched, so it made sense. I think when we were doing Twisted Metal 1 and 2, they were like Creep Show, or they were like cartoony Twilight Zones. I've talked about them in the past being like horror versions of Knock Knock jokes. It's like a setup and a payoff. I want this. You get this. Uh-oh, you got screwed. That's what 1 and 2 were about, and it made sense to they looked like they should be that kind of story. The budget made them be that kind of story. The T rating made sense to be that kind of story. But the minute we said, okay, we're going to go dark and take this world very seriously, the storytelling had to be more mature. It had to be more nuanced and layered.
I've been hitting Annie's body for well over an hour. You couldn't even tell who she was no more.
Those stories becoming more than just set up, payoff, little, oh, how does Calypso screw you this time? Really is nothing more than the fact that when the genre became mature and aiming at a older audience, we knew the older audience was going to demand a more sophisticated form of storytelling.
From the looks of them, you'd think I was a nasty piece of work. I was beginning to think I'd never discover the truth. The truth just kind of waltzes in through my door. Guy's name was Calypso. He ran this contest. He tells me he can clear everything up. I tell him to get lost before I break his freaking neck. But then he shows me this picture. Me, in a suit, all nice and neat, like I was actually someone important. He said there was this whole life just waiting for me. All I had to do was win his contest. How could I refuse? Now I had a chance to get the answers I needed. Let's face it, who wants to spend the rest of their life as a nobody?
Don't get me wrong, some things are still considerably goofy, and some of the stories are kind of dry or shallow, but the way Jaffe and the other writers involved depicts these psychos and their struggles were completely unfounded before this.
I must have been out for hours. At first there was just darkness, but then I started to see things. Bad things. I ran with this gang. At first we were small time. Random beatings, robbery. We were nobodies, so we came up with a plan. The bomb was choice. Freaking huge. When that building came down, who knew what kind of viruses and diseases would spread across the world? It was glorious. Instant extinction. Finally, for the first time, we were important. We were feared. The memories end there. I don't think I like the man I'm turning out to be.
In the first 2 games, a lot of the endings can get a laugh out of you due to its more cynical nature or hokey performances. But when it comes to this game, it's considerably harrowing and heartrending.
Jesus. I was FBI. I'd been deep undercover for the last year trying to bust a doomsday cult in Midtown. Calypso said I was a hero. That night I rushed back into the building. I had to get that bomb as far away as I could, but there just wasn't time. So I took the quick way out. The explosion knocked me out. I am a hero. A hero undercover agent standing in front of number 2 on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. In other words, a dead man. Calypso thanked me for being such a great contestant. Then he said goodbye. I remember now. I have a family. God, I was just starting to remember.
What am I left to feel for this character, other than sadness? I think it helps that we're provided more than a simple description and ending. The prologue and midway point of their stories, layered with inner monologues, help players connect with that particular character more than ever before. After all, storytelling in video games was evolving through this new generation's hardware, so Twisted Metal naturally embraced that change by also evolving within its own series. Twisted Metal Black wasn't just more mature, it was something that tries to hit you deeply within, to make you really feel for some of these characters and their plights, and others you're just supposed to either despise or fear.
And as a bonus, he didn't just operate on my head, he gave me a new pair of hands.
It's serious, grounded. Well, for the most part. Some of the logistics are definitely more than questionable.
I had seen fear in a man's eyes before, but this was different.
How? I mean, maybe he just means the feel of the room, but how can he even know that's the surgeon? He's muffled. And furthermore...
You know, that was the first time I ever knocked someone out with one punch.
A good way to compare how different their direction is with the stories would be the Roadkill ending in the original Twisted Metal 1, and the Outlaw ending in this game. Both stories are almost exactly the same on paper. A man in service made a big mistake that cost the lives of those he tried to protect, so he wants to turn back the clock in order to right his wrongs, and, well, let's just take a look.
I lost them all. 25 good men, and I sent them straight into an enemy trap. I want a second chance, Calypso. Word is, you can give me that.
I dealt with a lot of dirtbags before, but for some reason, this was different.
All units open fire! Open fire! Shoot to kill!
All these years trying to make a difference. And for what? So that we could arrest these scum suckers and watch them walk free the same afternoon? My rage got the better of me. I couldn't focus. I got them. But not before I made the biggest mistake of my life. I'd let my emotions cloud my judgment. It cost me, but it cost someone else even more. Oh my God. What had I done? Those people were dead, and it was all my fault. There was only one way out. But that way was closed. I was going to have to live with it for the rest of my life, and nothing I could do would ever take away the pain. Until now.
I wonder if you really know what it means to go back in time. Really to go back.
Damn it, I don't need a lecture. I need to save my men. I need more time.
I can give you time, but to go back into
Give me what I want. Give me what I earned. I won.
He asked if I really wanted a second chance. If I understood the risks. But I wasn't going to screw up twice. This time, it was all going to work out. I demanded my prize. And just like that, I was back.
My God, he did it.
Commander, if you can hear me, we're heading into the forge. We'll keep you posted on what we find.
No! Stay out of there! Stay out of the forge!
Yes, sir. Pulling back, sir.
Wait for me! You guys stay put! No.
With Twisted Metal 1, it just kind of ends abruptly. For Twisted Metal Black, it's fair to say that Outlaw's ending is predictable, but with how they set up his story throughout the campaign, this becomes one of those cases where you just really want things to end up in his favor. You're internally begging for it.
He's drawing a weapon! All units open fire! Open fire! Shoot to kill!
I made sure every single bullet found the right target this time. That dirtbag went down like a puppet with his strings cut.
Terrorist is down! Terrorist is down! Great shooting, Agent. Second team, move it!
But it wasn't over. Not until I knew those people were safe.
But as soon as you see it taking that last turn, it just tears you up inside and...
I never thought it could be like...
All units, target is knocked down. Target is still hot.
I was so close to making it right.
Agent Stone, report in. Are you hit?
You're starting to get it, right? This kind of stuff couldn't be done with just a minute-long ending. Sadly, these tales of desperate contestants would be completely removed from the European version of the game, for one simple reason.
Just violent.
Please, no, I got a family.
Shut up and bleed, you motherfucker.
My understanding, and I may be explaining this poorly, is that unlike America, where, you know, you can put whatever you want into the marketplace and there are ratings. I mean, we're not even legally obligated to put ratings on the games if we don't want to. Sony could release a XXX level violent sex game on PlayStation. They'd get a lot of PR shit for it. But the ESRB is not a legal body, right? So it really is more of good PR and making sure that parents know what their kids are playing in America. My understanding is in England, there is actually a government body that decides if things are at the sort of level of violence or gratuity or sexuality to even be allowed on the shelves of the UK. And so I know with God of War, it was just like, look, there are some things you cannot do that you're doing in the American version. With Black, I don't even think we had that conversation. I think it was just, we shipped the game and one day my boss is like, oh, they have to take the movies out. I really wasn't privy to that. I don't know if it was that there wasn't enough time to come back to me and say, Jaffe, here are the 12 things the UK government has a problem with. Can you re-edit these? Or if the title had never done that well in the UK anyway. So they're like, you know what? Fuck it. We're not going to spend another, $300,000 doing an edit just for Europe. Nobody gives a shit about this game in Europe anyway. Just fucking cut the movies and let's get on with our fucking lives. I have no idea what the motivation was. It could have been either of those, but I wasn't privy to that. If they came to me at the time and said, hey, Jaffe, we're going to have, here are some offensive cuts and we're going to give you 3 weeks to fix this so the European audience can have more satisfying Twisted Metal endings, of course, we would have done it in a heartbeat, but it was never presented to us as an option.
It must have been a bummer for Twisted Metal fans across the pond, but at least these days the removed cutscenes can be easily found online. While the majority of the roster consists of returning vehicles, just about all the drivers are either original or heavily redesigned. Most notably Sweet Tooth, now looking like a terrifying slasher villain.
We knew almost immediately we wanted him to be sinister, dangerous, like a fucking slasher. It was clear immediately we weren't going to be going back to the old Sweet Tooth, which was sometimes personified as literally a clown, like his skin didn't have makeup, he just had white skin and he was a clown. Other times it was a guy playing a clown. We knew we weren't going to be doing that. We knew that he was going to be this guy who was formidable, dangerous, creepy as fuck, wearing this really demented mask that was sort of our own version of Freddy Krueger. But in terms of exactly what he looked like, we probably arrived at his body type and his costume relatively quick. And the core idea of the mask we knew right away, but it probably took us a good maybe 2 or 3 months to sort of work with Martin Mercer and Cecil Kim, who were the artists that I really worked with to develop what ultimately has become his sort of signature mask that was introduced in Black.
Sweet Tooth going from the rather forgettable design from Twisted Metal 2 to this was certainly a change for the better, deeming him a great face for the franchise. And the liberties they took to designing Mr. Grimm did not go without giving him a faint resemblance to his old skeletal design. Now a war veteran instead of the Reaper of Souls, this was an interesting way to have the character keep the spirit of his well-known motif. Yellow Jacket, absent since the first Twisted Metal, makes a return, and the driver is still Sweet Tooth's father, technically. In the story, Mr. Kane, a man who was shot and killed, brought back to life through haphazard technology, his own rotting corpse controlled by his autistic son. And I'm not just making that up, that's what his file says. Eat it, Power Rangers and Sesame Street. Twisted Metal was progressive before you. The correlations Twisted Metal Black shares with the original 2 games are likely what encouraged fans to scour for very thin connections between their worlds. Players have all kinds of ridiculous theories on why they were written the way they were, some which only make sense to the person spouting them out. I think this kind of behavior stemmed from the monologues coming from Minion, the game's mid-boss who can be unlocked as a playable character. Considering he has no cutscenes, these are the only bits of his story we receive, but they're more important to the overall world than you would initially think once you decipher these assortments of numbers. He talks like this entire world is made up inside Sweet Tooth's head, hence the familiar names and vehicles, I suppose. I miss the colorful world, possibly talking about the first 2 games? Still, it could just mean the real world isn't so dark and grim. And of course, the last line, Marcus Kane? Like, from Twisted Metal 2? Considering what he said before, it actually kinda makes sense. Kind of. His desire to wake up from this nightmare, the connections are pretty obvious. However, maybe we should have slowed our rolls back in 2001.
I don't think fans would be at fault for overthinking them. I think it makes sense. Why would you not? But the truth of the matter is, I had to write dialogue for every character. And that particular character was like, oh shit, we forgot to write dialogue for this guy and we're out of fucking time. Jaffe, write something. And I was at home getting over the flu. And I remember just going, I don't have any more stories. I don't know what the fuck this guy's story is. I don't want to write a 3-act story at all. I'm not in the mood. And so I just said, you know what? Let's make it a code. He's a hidden character anyway. If you find it, let's make it a code. It'll be fun to crack the code. This is before the internet was a huge thing. So I figured, okay, it might take a month for the first person to write into EGM and say, I know what the code is, you know? And it was literally born out of the need to write something quick. That's really what it was. And making it a code was just something fun to do. And then when I kind of said, okay, I'm going to make it a code. I'm going to make it cryptic. I'm going to make it something that is hidden. What would be a really good, fun story for this guy that's not like a 3-act structure, just like a reveal at the end? And that's really where it came from. It was just sort of like, I mean, it's total lazy writing. I mean, and I'm not saying that like, haha, fuck you audience, I got one on you. It was sloppy writing. I mean, I don't consider myself a professional writer. I knew for what we were doing, it would be satisfying and interesting for the audience. And I figured if there was ever a sequel, we could deal with it then. But in terms of it being anything more like it was like, oh, we want to tell the next game is actually about the colorful world fighting the black and white. It was never that.
It's funny hearing David, the head writer, speak about Minions dialogue in this way, considering how obsessed people were over these messages, as well as any other possible connections this has with the original games. I think the fact that it was coded is what made it more interesting for people to read into the entire supposed lore of Twisted Metal more diligently. Speaking further about the story, it shouldn't be a surprise how much pushback Jaffe received when it came to the cutscenes. Just about everyone's story was changed one way or the other, and while a lot of the changes were under David and the other writers' accord, that wasn't always the case.
So somebody, and I don't know if this was coming from Utah, I don't know if this was coming from Sony, but somebody had a real problem that we were calling the Preacher character, which now I call Preacher, I don't give a fuck. And in the new Twisted Metal, he's called Preacher. But back then, he has to go out of his way to say, there's a line in there where he says, I wasn't even a preacher. I was an evangelist. I was kicked out of the church. It's like, okay, we got it. This guy's not officially sanctioned by the fucking church.
I wasn't even a real preacher. I was an evangelist, rejected by the church.
You know, it was such horseshit. But that was fine. But the one that bothered me about that character was, you know, he goes crazy and he is basically baptizing a baby. And in his mind, he was seeing it as a demon that he had to basically shove under the water. And we had a beautifully violent cutscene of that actually happening. And we were never allowed to use it because we could imply it. But the idea of actually seeing the preacher take an infant and shove it underwater and drown it as it's kicking and all this shit, I guess was a bridge too far for some folks that at the time had the keys to the kingdom. So we weren't able to do that.
I don't know, I guess Sony just wasn't ready for one of their first party titles to show a baby being drowned. I'm even a little worried about showing this much of it right now. These squabbles between David's team and the higher-ups got so bad, they ended up involving Kaz Hirai, Chief Operations Officer of Sony Computer Entertainment at the time, who would later become the CEO.
I remember sitting in a meeting, which is probably one of the few times in my life I've actually spoken to Kaz Hirai, and he was up in Foster City, and the head of marketing, or one of the big wigs at marketing, was having some issues with the movies, and I was not budging. I'm like, no, I'm not fucking changing this shit. To their credit, my production bosses were saying, we're not changing it either. Let's let Kaz make the decision. Ultimately, we're not going to budge, and marketing's not going to budge. So let's have a meeting with the guy and go through whatever issues that they were having. I remember them having a problem with Dollface's father. The guy who put her in the mask was originally her dad. And they seemed to have a problem with that, and so we had to change it to make it a guy she worked for named Mr. Creel, I think his name was, which was a throwback to the Warhawk movies and PS1 era, because the bad guy's name was Creole, and we were just taking the piss out of it. But I also remember we had a conversation which just blew my mind, where she was like, I'm having a problem with the Bloody Mary story. I'm like, well, what's your problem? Well, there's child-on-child violence in that story. I'm like, what the fuck is child-on-child violence? Did you just make that up? When I was a kid and I got in fights with people, it was just called a fight. I didn't know there was a saying, or there was a phrase. So there was a more prolonged shot where Bloody Mary picked up this pipe and beat the shit out of this kid that pushed her down in the mud, and really kind of showed her first, not murder, but her first, dance with that kind of level of violence, where she just lets it all hang out and goes ape shit. And I know that was a fight that marketing won. Don't ask me why. It's like, really? You guys are going to fucking die on this stupid fucking hill? Fine. So we still had the story be that Bloody Mary hit the guy, but we just didn't show it. It happened off screen.
Beyond these fights, when it came to how these disturbing tales were presented, just about everything he wanted to show still made it to the finalized game. Well, for North America.
So there were definitely some cuts, but at the end of the day, it all worked out pretty good. People seem to like them.
A good story doesn't always have to subvert your expectations. While it's good to avoid being predictable, what's arguably more important is to make the audience care about your characters. And that's something Twisted Metal Black managed to do with its most fleshed out cast. Even the ones you're supposed to fear, their backgrounds still tend to be pretty compelling. Jaffe has gone into detail about how he sunk himself into this world and the drivers thriving in it, putting just about all of his effort into these horrific tales of psychopaths in his tournament. Does that mean the gameplay suffered? He actually considers that to be the case.
I think the gameplay was too fast, frankly. I could be wrong, but I want to say we were running at 60 frames a second. And we were just like, holy shit, hold on to your fucking potatoes, Dr. Jones. And we got used to it at that speed. And we just kind of, didn't realize how fast of a game it was until we put it out. One of the things that made Twisted Metal 2, I think, a deeper game is because it was slower and the weapons were slower. And so players actually had a bit of a moment to read and recognize things that other vehicles were doing and figure out a way to counter that or play defense, or whether they wanted to deal with the risk that they saw coming their way and drive into the fire in hopes of getting off a more powerful shot after they took that initial hit. With Black, it was just so goddamn fast that the player just doesn't really have as many opportunities to have that kind of in-game, in-the-moment tactical gameplay.
I mean, he might be speaking about it like they went too far, but I couldn't disagree more. The riveting pace of this game was incredible for me and felt so damn good to play. The ultra-tight controls also make it easy to get the hang of these bob and weave styles in order to lay quick damage on opponents. And never mind the devastating setups. It will forever be odd to me that he sees Twisted Metal Black as a step down when compared to Twisted Metal 2. But hey, it's a matter of taste. I don't think I can argue with the man himself about that. And at the very least, he sees the undeniable strength this entry bared, which was world building and heavy characterizations.
Between that and the fact that my head and my heart was at that point into creating the world, because the next game I would do was God of War, and so there was definitely a sense that I was beginning to want to get more into storytelling and world building and creating a narrative, and that was really what was getting me up in the morning. And I felt we had already kind of cracked the nut of the gameplay of Twisted Metal 2 on PS1. And so even though the gameplay was extremely important, it wasn't as important to me as creating an interesting world.
Twisted Metal Black was a fantastic title. The destructible environment, the tough as nails enemy AI, refined controls, attention to detail, grounded vehicle design more or less, and huge bosses. It felt like everything a new generation Twisted Metal should ever be, and then some. Of course, perhaps he felt they went a little too far with how much they wanted to refine the gameplay. It certainly sticks out among the previous entries. Despite this, many fans and critics adored what Twisted Metal Black had to offer.
I remember one of the guys at Sony Santa Monica the day the reviews came out, and the reviews were fucking through the roof. There was like 9s out of 10s all over the place, great fucking reviews. And I remember he came up and he was looking over my shoulder when I was reading GameSpot's review, and he says, "This game is going to make so much fucking money." So we all thought we were onto something because the reviews were so fucking great. We as developers and super hardcore fans were ready to start to look at them as art pieces as well as commercial pieces.
It's interesting that David sees this game in that light. You have many developers, especially today, that try to strive for an interesting thought piece and nothing more when it comes to their games in the indie scene, all while bigger development teams try to go for what will be the most financially successful concoction in the AAA region. Ultimately, Jaffe wanted Twisted Metal Black to be a strong hybrid between both of these thought patterns. The problem is the concept of card combat is already kind of niche as it is. So, being experimental means more risks financially. Not only that, but the idea of making something as dark and gritty as this in the world of video games was still a bud back in 2001 regarding mass market appeal.
It was still early 2000s, and you were still getting a lot of that Super Nintendo, PS1 era games are just for kids. I think between putting out something that was so dark and embraced its darkness and had a big fucking M right on the title. And I remember being super excited when you flip it over and you read the descriptor and it's like blood, violence, cussing, all the reasons it got the M. I was like, this is fucking awesome, you know.
Still, something to take from this angle is that video games were already leaning towards catering to older and more mature audience as the sixth generation of gaming was booming forward into mass appeal. So, good on David and his crew for really being part of that kickstarting force.
Yeah, I mean, we were a little ahead of the curve there.
However, he thinks denying a big chunk of that potential audience in an attempt to drive the medium forward also kicked the game out from under its legs, commercially speaking. And he also feels the core mechanics were starting to show their age.
Between us losing a big segment of the audience that loved Twisted Metal, which was kids, and the fact that ultimately I think other than the people that really connected with Twisted Metal at a deep level, because you can play Twisted Metal Black, both split screen and online, like the fighting game we always wanted it to be, but most people don't see it that way, and most people had already gotten their fill of like if you don't see Twisted Metal as the fighting game that we designed it to be in this day and age, and it was starting to happen in 2001 when it came out, it comes across as a very shallow basic experience. It's like, well, I'm just driving around shooting stuff, what is there to fucking do?
He understands that Twisted Metal's core gameplay could be seen as considerably shallow and not as unique 6 years after the initial game. However,
in 1995, it was a brand new concept. But as the years have gone on, unless you really experience it as a fighting game, it just comes off as a very shallow kind of drive around, blow stuff up. And every generation gets less and less interest in a game that simple. And we have a harder and harder time communicating that the game's not really that simple. You just have to sort of, kind of know how to play it.
Something that could emphasize the depth of the gameplay would be online multiplayer in order to get a glimpse of what high-level playing looked like. With that said, Twisted Metal Black would be re-released shortly after. Story mode was removed in favor of online multiplayer that can have up to 8 people in one match. When it came to other online players trying to survive, it was madness. And believe it or not, custom servers are still up for this game. I think that speaks for how important Twisted Metal Black is to people, even if speaking purely at a gameplay perspective. On top of that, the team used an in-house engine, firstly named the Kinetica Engine, for the game of the same name Jaffe had a hand in that launched a few months before Twisted Metal Black. This engine is still being used as a foundation for Sony's games today. That's one way to leave a legacy. As a kid who was still learning how bleak and dark pieces of entertainment can really be, and not just at a surface level, this was an enthralling experience. What started out as nightmares turned into fond memories for my little psyche. Everything Twisted Metal Black set out to be hit me at a perfect point in my life. And I like to think I'm not the only one who felt that way. But what does David think about that? What does he think about making something so demented and disturbing that managed to get into the hands of kids who may have been fans of the older Twisted Metal games with supervision so lax that they'll buy them a game not intended for children?
There was a big M on the box, so it really wasn't designed with kids in mind. However, I was a kid who grew up with horror. I was a kid who grew up with slasher movies. I literally just took my daughters this last weekend to see Halloween. My daughters are 15 and 13. I love my youngest daughters getting into horror and things like that. So the thing is, it shouldn't be, but it is an impossible thing to really appreciate and take in when you have fans of work that you've helped create and they talk to you about the warm memories they have of what you've helped to create, especially when they had those memories when they were children. Because I have memories like that. Like if I've met Spielberg once before, and Raiders to me was and remains everything. It got me into being a creative individual. But now I know it's like I could sit there and just totally go off and like, dude, this meant so much to me. It was this, it was that, it was this. And because he came at it from a totally different place, he was probably like, I was just working, making something I thought was cool. So when I hear people say they were kids and this game actually scared them, I think that's awesome. You know, I'd like to think that parents knew their kids were playing it because it was an M-rated game, and I always did take that seriously. I think parents should be responsible for what their kids do. But the fact that there are kids out there that got a taste of horror and darkness through a game I had a lot to do with, and they have fond memories of being freaked out and scared by the shit we came up with, I love that. That makes me very happy to know that me and the team got to contribute to people's creative enjoyment and creative development when it comes to sort of dark, scary horror stuff.
Perhaps people see this stuff as too edgy these days. Maybe they're right and my nostalgic bias is showing, but I can't help but love what Jaffe and Campbell created with this early PlayStation 2 title. It messed me up in all the right ways. Around the time Twisted Metal Black's production was ending, people at Incog Ink began to develop Twisted Metal Small Brawl, released only 5 months after that gritty PS2 title. Just what we need, right? Another Twisted Metal game rushed to shit. Despite the fact that this was being developed within Incog Ink, the typical crew was not involved, with David moving towards other projects and Scott Campbell only having the mere role of executive producer. A cute piece of childlike wonder, kids going head to head wielding these devastating, destructive RC cars. The game brings storytelling back to its PS1 roots, but of course the whole thing is a lot more lighthearted. I think the portrayal of Calypso as a punk-ass bully was pretty funny.
If you ever want to see your thirsty widow Foggy again, you gotta play my game.
Everything felt very wholesome with only a dash of cynicism, especially compared to... Sweet Tooth's ending is peculiar. It almost feels like a jab towards his awful ending in Twisted Metal 3.
All the candy and ice cream you want? Your wish is granted.
You could have anything you wanted, and all you could think of is a little ice cream? Let me down! Stop the car!
Jaffe would have been more involved in this game, but this was being planned around the time God of War started to get off the ground, a huge project he dove deeply into as director. And during this time, Scott Campbell was looking into new ways to continue the Twisted Metal series, which we'll discuss in a bit. Small Brawl has its own charm and even utilizes the original engine used for Twisted Metal 1 and 2. The game isn't perfect, and I was already too spoiled by how good Twisted Metal Black felt at the time. However, it sounds like the presentation would have turned out differently if David was actually part of its production. For those wondering, he came up with the initial concept but didn't have any involvement past that.
So Twisted Metal Small Brawl was my idea, but I wanted to do an M-rated Mad Magazine body version of Small Brawl. So it was originally pitched. There was a PS1 game at the time where you played this mosquito, like an arcadey flight game. And it was a mosquito flying around a little Japanese household. And there was part of it where there's this hot teenage girl taking a bubble bath. And one of the levels is you're flying around her almost totally exposed naked body. And it was meant to be kind of, body and sexual and all this stuff, but kind of naughty and everything.
Oh shit, I love Mr. Mosquito.
And I remember seeing that and I said, that's so cool to see miniaturization, which we've seen in movies since the 50s, but it's always portrayed so benign. It's always like Honey, I Shrunk the Kids and all that shit. It was the first time I had seen, when you're playing this mosquito, this idea of that's a neat juxtaposition, what we usually think of as family friendly when miniaturization is there. What if we do make it like R-rated Mad Magazine? So it was going to be the same attitude of Twisted Metal 2, kind of irreverent, fuck authority, and these cars were going to be driving around. We were going to do our version of the teenage or the sexy young woman having the bath or the shower. We were going to have like the plumber fixing the sink, and you could like shoot missiles up his butt crack and his pants would come down. Just stuff that was juvenile, but it was very in that kind of, Porky's 80s teen comedy vibe. And that was what I loved about it.
Jaffe's original idea for Small Brawl sounds really entertaining. The concept of having this surface-level, family-friendly appeal, but being rated M and showing exactly why it's rated such in so many ways, is more like Conker's Bad Fur Day. First glance, you might think it's another cute platformer, but there's so much more to that raunchy title from beginning to end. It seems as though the people that took over didn't want to get too cheeky with the concept. I think the only part that rings true of his original idea would be Axel's ending, which ended up being removed, funny enough. A little too cynical, folks? Come on, this is stuff primetime TV around the same time even poked fun at.
I ended up going off to work on God of War. I sort of was only on the project for 2 or 3 meetings, very much like War of the Monsters. And then it went primarily to Utah. Without somebody like me to stir the pot, their natural inclination at that studio, for the most part, was always to go family friendly, was always to go Nickelodeon, was always to try to be Disney, was always wholesome shit that I fucking hate. And so it very quickly became this sort of, at the most irreverent and violent, it was the Goonies. But it probably wasn't even that edgy. It was probably more like Barney, is what it felt like more often than not to me. I barely played the game. I hear a lot of people who have played it genuinely like it, and they made a really good Twisted Metal game that not a lot of people talk about.
Regardless, Small Brawl was still a solid game and managed to be one last hurrah for the PlayStation 1 from the series before moving on. Or trying to. This and Twisted Metal Black felt like Incog Ink planting their feet back on the Twisted Metal soil right where they deserve to be. Make a game that felt like a throwback to Twisted Metal 2 as a way to reclaim that throne in an imaginative childlike way, all while blazing this new path with a demented and deliciously dark take on the universe. What better way to take back the franchise? Well...
Welcome back to Twisted Metal.
As time went on, after Twisted Metal's triumphant return on the PlayStation 2 and the silly RC car spin-off, the franchise would not be seeing too much activity for a good while. Part of this is due to David being dedicated to a brand new project. He was still popping off ideas for new games, but as production for Twisted Metal Black was wrapping up, Jaffe's new baby, God of War, was really taking shape behind closed doors.
I was making God of War. Scott had sold Incognito to Sony, so they were a Sony division at that point. They worked through Sony Santa Monica. They did like Downhill Domination, War of the Monsters, and Twisted Metal Head-On as a launch title.
God of War was such a big project for Santa Monica Studio, it would not see the light of day until March 22, 2005, almost 4 years after the launch of Twisted Metal Black. Sony's first portable system, known as the PSP, would be released just 2 days later, and coincidentally, a part of the launch lineup would be a piece by Scott Campbell and the folks remaining at Incognito Entertainment known as Twisted Metal Head-On. However, the game eventually did receive a PlayStation 2 port years later with David's involvement, but more on that another time. It opens up to an action-packed intro full of familiar mobiles of mass destruction. Nearly the entire cast of Twisted Metal 2 return. Well, vehicle-wise. This introduction does an awesome job bringing back so many memories. Along with returning characters, we see an array of new faces with their own unique backgrounds and stories. While noticeably cleaner looking than the grody cast from Twisted Metal 2, it's worth noting we see some pretty messed up outcomes from them. The gameplay was pretty status quo, wreck everyone in the competition with any weapons you can find in the battlefield. Although new features include bonus stages and upgrades you can take from defeated enemies. The stage design does go back to the idea of going around the world, visiting famous landmarks. And yes, of course you can blow up the Eiffel Tower again. With returning characters and the luxury of destroying your opponents across the globe, both figuratively and literally, this game really harks back to Twisted Metal 2's rowdy, explosive gameplay and global theme. Early on, fans would dub it the real Twisted Metal 3. Regarding gameplay, it's not really a step up from how Twisted Metal Black felt in regards to the PlayStation 2 port, but on a PSP it was really nice. The pace feels like a middle ground between Twisted Metal 2 and Black. Although, and this could just be how the crew reflected on Twisted Metal Black over the years, the game is not nearly as challenging as that early PlayStation 2 title. In fact, Head-On is probably the easiest game in the franchise. Upgrades make your character considerably overpowered, falling off a stage is no longer an instant death, quick healing pickups give you more health than ever before, and clearing houses typically fill your inventory beyond its capacity. This is still a fun title all in all, I just can't help but notice the lack of challenge. Although I suppose one would say the real challenge was in its online play. Pretty impressive for a launch title on a 2005 handheld. The story is what caught my interest the most though. A lot of these tales serve as continuations to many characters from Twisted Metal 2, ultimately marking the 989 titles as non-canon, assuming anyone even cared about those awful endings. You should already know David barely concerns himself over that kind of thing.
Who? My sister! I know she competed in Twisted Metal a few years back, and no one has heard from her since. You'd better talk, and talk fast.
Ah, yes. Your sister Amanda. Yes, she was a truly great competitor. In fact, if I remember correctly, Amanda won the year she competed.
If she won, where is she?
I, for one, could not believe they actually created a story for Outlaw that spanned across Twisted Metal 1, 2, and now Head On. We finally get to see both Carl and Jamie confront Calypso, witnessing their ultimate fate. The consistency between all three games for Outlaw was a wonderful treat. It looks like Needles is more comfortable with the design featured in black, which would cement his most iconic appearance. We see a few other continuations, such as Krista Sparks in her trusty dune buggy, Axel in his giant wheels, yes, they ruined his satisfying little tale of becoming a free man, and Simon Whittlebone in his Caterpillar 950, but he looks and sounds completely different.
Simon Whittlebone, is that you?
Of course it's me! Who else would it be?
Just checking. There are a lot of evil spirits floating around that would love to get a free wish.
You know who I am, and you know why I'm here.
No one will ever be as high or as great as me! Damn it! I am Simon Whittlebone! I am God!
I know I'm probably the only person who cares, but it's just such an annoying and worthless change. We went from Michael Douglas with a heavy Swedish accent to Stephen Root with Big Al's voice from Ratchet & Clank. The inconsistency is so obvious. Come on, I was just bitching at Twisted Metal 3 for pulling the same crap. Otherwise, we get satisfying conclusions for some of the characters we loved back in 1996, and more interesting lore behind a few of these tales. Although, I was really surprised by the absence of Mel McMurrin.
I raise my glass to the one competitor who's made it all the way.
He voiced Calypso in Twisted Metal 2, and his performance was pretty iconic for the series. Even in the stinkier entries, he reprised Calypso. Hell, I was able to get him to reprise the role, and I'm just a dumb nerd with a YouTube channel. The majority of the script was performed by him in Twisted Metal 2, so needless to say, his voice is hard to forget. I understand Head On had less focus on Calypso's perspective in the storytelling, but McMurrin returning would have been a nice cherry on top of this long time coming sequel sundae. Something important to take away from this game is that Incognito managed to provide a new car combat experience that has that rough and tumble feel from these creative American developers. While David Jaffe was not involved in its development, Scott and the crew understood how to make a true Twisted Metal experience with Head On, at least from a gameplay perspective. Their hand at storytelling definitely needed some work.
So I remember being in the GameStop doing a big release night for God of War in 2005. That was the exact same day that the PSP came out, was the same day God of War launched. And so Scott had a game on the shelf the same time I did. So I was so swamped with God of War, I was super aware they were working on a new Twisted Metal, but I barely ever touched it until it came out. So I really had nothing to do with it. The only thing I had to do with Head On was when we started Eat, Sleep, Play, and we did sort of the extra Twisted edition for PS2, but I had nothing to do with the actual original PSP version.
The game would be ported to PlayStation 2 a few years later. Like just about all PSP games ported to PlayStation 2, it has problems here and there, but still serves its purpose as a way for players to experience the game when they didn't own a PSP. It's strange, people say the combat and pace feels better on PSP, but I can't really see the difference. Also, the PS2 port is at 60 FPS, while also utilizing that Kinetica engine used for Black, so it feels pretty damn good to play. While plenty of the visuals look rough, it feels much better to play than a lot of the other PSP games ported onto this console. I think it helps that the developers of the original game were involved. So, a pretty good deal for those without a PSP. Something they did to sweeten the deal was provide a bunch of extra content. That includes particular assets that derive from a project that never came to fruition. What's this? Twisted Metal Lost? Next time, please join me and David Jaffe on the final chapter of this retrospective series as we cover the infamously canceled sequel to Twisted Metal Black, as well as the franchise's triumphant return in 2012 with Twisted Metal on PlayStation 3. Thank you so much for watching, especially those who patiently waited for this entry of the Twisted Metal retrospective. Part 3 is coming soon, but while you wait, check out my other videos. I did a really long analysis on Dead Rising 4, a really long analysis on Travis Strikes Again, and a bunch of other stuff. Special shout out to my patrons who continue to support me. Thanks for sticking around.